Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with a confession. The old saying goes, sometimes it walks past you on a cold morning wearing your own face. The wind moved sharply through the streets of downtown Chicago, weaving between glass towers and steel bus shelters, carrying the smell of roasted coffee and the low hum of early traffic. It was 7:18 a.m., the kind of gray Midwestern morning where the sky looked like brushed aluminum and everyone walked a little faster than usual, collars pulled up, phones already glowing in their hands. At the corner of Wacker Drive and Adams Street, a long black Rolls-Royce eased to the curb beside a polished office tower that reflected the river like a sheet of silver. The rear door opened with quiet precision, and Alexander Reed stepped out into the cold. At 39, Alexander Reed was a name that appeared in business magazines, financial broadcasts, and headlines about billion-dollar mergers. Founder and CEO of Reed Global Systems, he had built a technology empire that touched everything from logistics networks to financial data platforms. Analysts called him disciplined, strategic, sometimes ruthless. Investors called him brilliant. But the people who worked closest to him knew something else about Alexander Reed. He did not believe in coincidences. He believed in numbers, timing, leverage, and outcomes that could be measured on a quarterly report. Fate, in his mind, was just a romantic word people used when they didn't understand the math. That morning he adjusted the cuff of his charcoal coat, stepped onto the sidewalk, and nodded briefly to his driver before the car doors shut behind him with a quiet click. His building rose 52 stories above the river, a sleek structure of glass and steel that mirrored the winter sky. He had an 8 a.m. board call, 2 investor briefings, and a lunch meeting with a venture group from San Francisco. His schedule lived in 15-minute increments, every hour mapped weeks in advance. Yet something unusual happened before he reached the front doors of the tower. It was small at first, barely more than a shift in his attention. Across the street, beside a city bus shelter where commuters gathered in neat winter coats, 2 small figures stood side by side near the edge of the sidewalk. Alexander didn't stop walking right away. He simply slowed. Something about them caught his eye in the quiet, involuntary way. A reflection catches light. They were children, a boy and a girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. Both wore bright knit hats and matching navy jackets zipped up to their chins. The boy's backpack hung crookedly on one shoulder, and the girl held a lunchbox shaped like a cartoon rocket ship. They stood close together, not talking, just watching the traffic crawl past in the slow rhythm of morning commuters. But that wasn't what made Alexander Reed pause in the middle of a Chicago sidewalk. It was their faces. The boy turned slightly toward the streetlight, and the thin winter sun slipped between buildings just long enough to illuminate his features. Dark lashes, a firm little chin, a familiar curve in the mouth that looked almost stubborn. Alexander felt something inside him shift, subtle but undeniable. For a brief second, he thought he was looking at an old photograph of himself as a child. The thought was so unexpected that he almost dismissed it instantly. Children resembled adults all the time. It meant nothing. Genetics created patterns everywhere. But then the girl turned her head too, brushing snowflakes from the sleeve of her jacket. Her eyes were the same shade of deep gray Alexander saw every morning in the mirror while tying his tie. The same steady, thoughtful gaze. The same slight dimple appearing when she pressed her lips together. Alexander stopped walking entirely now. Around him, commuters continued toward the building entrance, their footsteps echoing softly on the pavement, but the city noise seemed to pull away from him for a moment. The boy bent down to retie his sneaker, his hat sliding slightly sideways as he worked at the knot. The girl nudged him impatiently, pointing toward the approaching bus that rumbled down the street like a slow yellow train. Alexander told himself again that it was coincidence. Chicago had nearly 3 million people. Somewhere in that crowd, there were bound to be children who shared similar features. The mind simply noticed patterns when it wanted to. Yet his feet didn't move. Instead, he found himself studying the children more carefully than a stranger reasonably should. The boy finished tying his shoe and stood again, adjusting his backpack strap. For a second, he glanced directly across the street. Directly at Alexander Reed. The resemblance struck harder this time, like the sudden clarity of a reflection when water stops rippling. It wasn't just the eyes or the shape of the jaw. It was the expression. Calm, focused, slightly analytical, even at that young age. The same quiet concentration Alexander's teachers once wrote about on elementary school report cards decades earlier in a small Ohio classroom. Alexander felt a strange tightness in his chest. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't confusion exactly. It was something more disorienting than either of those. Recognition without explanation. The bus shelter glass rattled as a gust of wind pushed through the street, scattering a few dry leaves along the curb. The girl leaned closer to the boy and said something Alexander couldn't hear from across the traffic. The boy nodded with serious importance, as if they were discussing something far more complicated than the arrival of a school bus. Then Alexander noticed something else. Their posture. The way they stood side by side, shoulders square, alert to the movement of the street. It was strangely familiar, like watching two smaller versions of a stance he had practiced his entire adult life, when entering boardrooms full of investors. And that was when the next moment arrived, the one that would quietly rearrange everything Alexander Reed believed about coincidence. A woman stepped into view behind the children. She moved with the kind of steady calm that came from years of early mornings and responsibilities that never waited. One hand adjusted the scarf around the girl's neck, while the other rested lightly on the boy's shoulder. Alexander didn't see her face immediately. At first he only noticed the dark wool coat, the simple leather bag hanging from her shoulder, and the careful way she straightened the boy's backpack strap. But then she turned slightly, brushing a loose curl away from her cheek. And Alexander Reed forgot how to breathe for half a second. Because the woman standing beside the two children at the bus stop was someone he had not seen in 6 years. Zara Mitchell. The name rose in his mind before he even consciously thought it. Zara Mitchell, who once sat across from him in a small coffee shop near Northwestern University, discussing startup ideas on a napkin. Zara Mitchell, whose laugh used to fill quiet rooms in a way that made ordinary evenings feel brighter. Zara Mitchell, the one woman who had known him before the money, before the headlines, before the boardrooms. Turned his life into a schedule of calculated decisions. And the woman he had walked away from without ever looking back. Zara didn't notice him at first. She was focused on the children, kneeling slightly to zip the girl's jacket higher against the cold. The boy tugged at her sleeve and pointed toward the arriving bus. Alexander stood frozen on the sidewalk across the street, watching a moment of someone else's ordinary morning unfold with impossible clarity. The bus slowed with a deep mechanical sigh. Its doors opened. The children turned toward Zara, each giving her a quick hug before climbing the steps. But just before the boy disappeared inside, he glanced back over his shoulder again, directly at Alexander Reed. The same gray eyes, the same thoughtful expression. And in that quiet, ordinary moment on a Chicago morning, something impossible settled into place inside Alexander's mind like a final piece of a puzzle sliding into view. Because the resemblance was no longer coincidence. It was certainty. And for the first time in Alexander Reed's carefully controlled life, the future he thought he understood had just stepped onto a yellow city bus, wearing his own face. The bus pulled away from the curb with a long mechanical sigh, its yellow body folding into the flow of morning traffic while the doors closed behind the two children who had just climbed inside. Alexander Reed did not move. He remained standing on the opposite sidewalk as the vehicle merged into the slow current of cars heading east, its rear lights shrinking block by block until it disappeared behind the gray canyon of office towers. For several seconds the city around him continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Taxis rolled past. A delivery truck rumbled over a pothole. Someone across the street laughed into a phone call. But Alexander Reed felt as if the entire world had shifted half an inch out of alignment. His mind did not rush to conclusions the way most people might have. That was not how he had built his life. Alexander Reed was a man trained to question patterns, to verify assumptions, to treat instinct as something that required evidence before belief. Yet the image of the boy's face stayed fixed in his memory with uncomfortable clarity. The eyes, the chin, the expression. He had spent his entire career identifying risk before it appeared on spreadsheets. And now his instincts were telling him something far stranger than any business problem he had ever faced. Across the street, Zara Mitchell still stood beside the empty bus shelter, her hand raised briefly in a small wave toward the departing bus. She lowered it slowly once the vehicle turned the corner. For a moment she remained there in the cold morning air, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, her posture calm and steady in a way that suggested this routine had happened every weekday for years. Alexander watched her carefully now, as if trying to confirm that she was truly the same woman he remembered. 6 years had passed since the last time he saw her. 6 years since a conversation that had ended quietly but permanently. Back then his life had been moving faster than anyone around him could keep up with. Venture capital meetings, product launches, investors pushing him to relocate the company headquarters to Chicago, the sudden pressure of a business expanding beyond anything he imagined in his 20s. Zara had been the one person who never seemed impressed by the momentum of it all. She had a way of listening to his plans with thoughtful patience, and then asking questions no investor ever did. Questions about balance, about what kind of life he actually wanted once success arrived. Alexander had not known how to answer those questions at the time. Or perhaps he simply did not want to slow down long enough to try. And so one evening 6 years earlier he had made a decision that seemed practical in the moment. He left Chicago for California to close a deal that would change the future of Reed Global Systems. He told himself the distance would be temporary, that he would call once the negotiations settled. But the deal turned into 3 more deals, then international expansion, then headlines and boardrooms and flights that crossed time zones faster than relationships could survive. By the time he thought about reaching out again, too much silence had passed. And now here she was again on a cold Chicago morning, standing exactly where he never expected to see her. Zara stepped away from the bus shelter and turned toward the sidewalk, preparing to leave. That was when she finally noticed him across the street. For a moment neither of them moved. Traffic continued to pass between them in a slow line of metal and headlights, but the distance suddenly felt far smaller than the width of the road. Zara's eyes met his. Recognition appeared immediately, not as shock, but as a quiet understanding that settled into her expression with surprising calm. She did not look angry. She did not look pleased either. Her gaze simply held his for a second longer than strangers usually hold eye contact. Then she crossed the street. Alexander did not remember deciding to stay where he was. His feet simply refused to move as she approached. The wind tugged lightly at the ends of her dark curls as she walked, her coat buttoned neatly against the cold. When she stopped a few feet away from him, the city noise seemed to soften again, like the moment before a question that has been waiting years to be asked. "Hello, Alexander," she said. Her voice sounded exactly the same as he remembered. Calm, measured, the kind of voice that rarely rushed into unnecessary words. Alexander nodded once, the motion slower than usual as his mind worked through a dozen thoughts at once. "Zara," he replied. The name felt unfamiliar on his tongue after so many years of silence. For a moment neither of them spoke again. The morning air carried the faint smell of fresh coffee from a cafe on the corner, and a commuter brushed past them without noticing the quiet tension between 2 people who shared a past neither of them had expected to revisit today. Alexander finally broke the silence with the first question that came to his mind, though it was not the question he truly wanted to ask yet. "You still live in Chicago?" Zara gave a small nod. "Yes." She studied his face briefly, as if confirming that time had changed him in the ways she might have expected. "Your company headquarters is 3 blocks from here. I assume you knew that." Alexander allowed a faint breath of acknowledgement. "I knew." Another pause settled between them, heavier this time. The image of the children stepping onto the bus replayed in his mind again, each detail sharper now that he knew who their mother was. He considered asking directly. The simplest path was often the most efficient one, yet the words did not arrive easily. Zara seemed to sense the direction of his thoughts before he spoke. She glanced toward the intersection where the bus had disappeared, then back at him. "They catch that bus every morning," she said quietly. Alexander felt the air shift slightly in his chest. The confirmation was subtle but unmistakable. He held her gaze carefully now. "How old are they?" The question came out lower than he intended, steady but carrying an edge of something he rarely allowed into his voice. Zara did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked down the street for a moment, watching another bus approach in the distance, though it was not the one her children rode. When she finally spoke, her tone remained calm, but carried a weight that seemed to stretch across the years between them. 6, she said. The number landed with quiet precision. Alexander Reed felt time rearrange itself inside his mind in a single instant. 6 years ago was the same year he boarded a plane to California. The same year he told himself that distance would be temporary. The same year he walked away from Zara Mitchell believing that life would eventually circle back in some convenient way once the chaos of success settled down. But life rarely returned things in convenient ways. Sometimes it returned them standing at a bus stop on a winter morning, wearing 2 small navy jackets and carrying faces that looked like reflections from a childhood photograph. Alexander's thoughts raced through calculations that had nothing to do with business strategy. He had always believed that every problem could be traced back to a starting point, a decision that set events into motion. Now that starting point stood directly in front of him in the shape of a woman who had quietly built a life without him. Zara watched the realization move across his expression. She did not smile. She did not show anger either. There was only a quiet steadiness in her eyes, the kind that comes from years of carrying answers someone else has not yet learned to ask. And in that moment Alexander Reed understood something with absolute certainty. The morning he thought would begin with board meetings and investor calls had just turned into the most important conversation of his life. The number lingered in the cold air between them longer than either of them expected. 6 years. It was a simple number, yet it stretched backward through time like a long, quiet corridor. Alexander Reed suddenly realized he had never walked down. For most of his adult life, numbers had always represented progress. Revenue growth, market share, quarterly expansion. Numbers were proof that his decisions worked. But this number did not measure success. It measured absence. Alexander looked past Zara for a moment toward the street where the bus had vanished minutes earlier. Somewhere several blocks away, 2 children were probably sitting near the middle of that bus, their small backpacks resting on their laps, talking about school assignments or cartoons, or the simple things children talk about when their world is still small and safe. And for 6 years he had not known they existed. His voice came slower now, less certain than the confident tone that usually filled conference rooms. 6 years, he repeated quietly. Zara nodded once. She did not look surprised by his reaction. If anything, she looked like someone who had already lived with this moment many times in her mind before it ever arrived. A gust of wind swept down the street, stirring the edges of her coat and pushing a loose curl across her forehead. She brushed it away without breaking eye contact. Alexander studied her expression carefully. In business meetings, he had developed a reputation for reading people quickly, for noticing the slight shifts in posture or tone that revealed what someone truly thought behind polite conversation. But Zara Mitchell had always been different. Even years ago, she never reacted in predictable ways. That same calm steadiness was still there now. "You found out after I left," Alexander said finally. It was not really a question. It was the only timeline that made sense. Zara rested one hand lightly against the strap of her bag as she considered the street again. Cars rolled past slowly, their headlights dull under the gray sky. 2 weeks later, she said. The words were quiet but clear. Alexander felt his chest tighten again, this time with a sharper understanding of what those weeks must have looked like from her side of the story. 2 weeks was not enough time for the world to rearrange itself around news like that. It was barely enough time to process it alone. He imagined the moment she might have realized. Perhaps standing in a bathroom, staring at a small test in disbelief. Perhaps sitting on the edge of a bed, trying to calculate. What came next? In every version of that moment, Alexander Reed was nowhere to be found. Zara continued speaking before he could respond. "I thought about calling you." She said it plainly, without accusation. More than once. Alexander nodded slowly, absorbing each word like a delayed echo from a conversation they should have had years earlier. "But you did not." She shook her head slightly. "You were already on the other side of the country building something important. Every news article had your name in it. Every business interview talked about how your company was expanding faster than anyone expected." Her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet truth behind it that did not need emphasis. "I figured you had already chosen the life you wanted." The sentence settled gently but firmly into the space between them. Alexander had spent 6 years believing his choices had been logical, necessary steps toward building the company that now employed thousands of people. Yet standing here on a Chicago sidewalk, he suddenly saw those choices through a completely different lens. Decisions that looked efficient in boardrooms could look very different when measured against the shape of a life he never knew existed. "You should have told me," he said after a moment. The words came out softer than he expected, not defensive but heavy with the realization that the past could not be rewound by saying them now. Zara looked at him steadily. And what would you have done? The question was not aggressive. It was sincere. Alexander opened his mouth, but no immediate answer came. For a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals with careful confidence, that silence felt unfamiliar. He thought about who he was 6 years earlier. The endless travel. The constant pressure from investors pushing him to expand faster. The nights spent reviewing contracts instead of sleeping. Would he have slowed down if he knew? Would he have stayed in Chicago instead of chasing the next opportunity across the country? The honest answer did not arrive easily. Zara seemed to understand that hesitation without needing to hear it explained. She gave a small breath that almost resembled a quiet laugh, though it carried no amusement. Exactly, she said gently. Alexander lowered his eyes for a moment, studying the lines in the sidewalk as commuters stepped around them on their way into nearby buildings. The world continued moving with the same urgency it always had, yet he felt as though he had stepped into a slower space where time unfolded differently. What are their names? He asked finally. Zara's expression softened slightly, the first visible shift in her composure since the conversation began. Lucas and Lila, she said. Alexander repeated the names quietly, testing how they sounded out loud. Lucas and Lila Reed. The thought formed naturally in his mind before he even realized it. He wondered if the children carried his last name or if Zara had chosen something else entirely. He realized quickly that he had no right to assume anything. Zara watched him carefully as he processed the information. They know about you, she added. Alexander looked up quickly. They do. She nodded once. I never lied to them. When they were old enough to ask questions, I told them the truth in the simplest way children understand things. Which is? Alexander asked. Zara glanced toward the intersection again, as if picturing the bus making its way toward an elementary school several neighborhoods away. That their father built a company that helps people move information around the world, she said. And that sometimes life pulls people in different directions. Alexander let out a slow breath. The explanation sounded far kinder than he deserved. They asked why you were not around, she continued. Children always ask that eventually. Alexander felt the question before he heard the answer. What did you tell them? Zara met his gaze again with the same calm honesty she had always carried. I told them you did not know they existed. The words did not carry blame. They simply carried truth. Alexander Reed stood quietly on that Chicago sidewalk as the meaning settled over him piece by piece. For 6 years, 2 children had grown up hearing about a father who did not know they were alive. A man whose absence had been explained with patience instead of bitterness. The realization filled him with something unfamiliar, something deeper than regret. It was the understanding that somewhere across the city 2 small lives had continued forward without him, shaped entirely by the strength of the woman standing in front of him. Zara adjusted her bag again and looked toward the tall glass building behind Alexander where employees were still filing through the revolving doors. You have a meeting soon, she said. It was not a question. Alexander almost smiled at the quiet accuracy of her observation. Even after 6 years, she still understood how his schedule worked. But the thought of walking into a conference room now felt strangely insignificant compared to the conversation unfolding here. He shook his head slowly. They get out of school at 3:15, Zara said after a moment. Alexander's eyes lifted again. You were telling me that for a reason. Zara gave a small nod. If you want to meet them, she said, that is when the bus comes back. The city traffic hummed steadily around them as Alexander Reed absorbed the invitation. For the first time in years, his carefully planned afternoon had just been replaced by something far more important, something that could not be scheduled months in advance or negotiated through contracts. At 3:15 that afternoon, 2 children would step off a yellow bus at the corner of Wacker Drive and Adams Street, and the man who had unknowingly missed the first 6 years of their lives would have to decide what kind of father he was willing to become. Alexander Reed remained on the sidewalk long after Zara Mitchell finished speaking, the sound of the city continuing around them in the steady rhythm of a weekday morning. A bus roared past on the opposite side of the street, its brakes releasing a long sigh of air, and somewhere behind them a taxi driver honked impatiently at a delivery truck blocking half the lane. Normally Alexander's mind filtered through noise like this without effort, focusing only on the next item on his schedule. But that morning the schedule that had once governed every minute of his day felt distant and strangely unimportant. Zara glanced once more toward the tall glass tower behind him, where Reed Global Systems occupied the upper floors. Employees were still streaming through the revolving doors, their coats dusted with cold wind, coffee cups balanced in their hands as they hurried toward elevators and conference calls. She knew that building well. Even before Alexander officially moved the headquarters there, the news about his company had been impossible to ignore. Chicago business journals covered every milestone as if it were a sports championship. Funding rounds, acquisitions, international expansion. Reed Global Systems had grown into one of the fastest rising technology companies in the country. Yet the man standing in front of her no longer looked like the confident executive she sometimes saw in interviews. He looked like someone who had just opened a door in his life that he never realized was locked. Alexander exhaled slowly, the cold air forming a faint cloud in front of him. 3:15, he repeated quietly, as if the number itself required careful understanding. Zara nodded once. That is when their bus returns. Alexander's eyes drifted briefly toward the intersection again, imagining the route the bus must travel each afternoon from the elementary school several neighborhoods away. Somewhere along that route, 2 children were spending their morning in classrooms, raising their hands to answer questions, laughing with friends during recess, living ordinary school days that had unfolded 6 years without him. The realization settled deeper each time he pictured it. They do not know they are meeting me today, he said. Zara shook her head gently. No, I did not want to promise them anything before I knew if you would want that. The honesty in the sentence carried no bitterness, only caution built from experience. Alexander understood what she meant. Over the past decade, he had watched business partners promise things they could not deliver. The consequences always fell hardest on the people who believed those promises. I want that, he said quietly. The words came out with a firmness that surprised even him. Zara studied his face for a moment, measuring the sincerity behind the statement the same way she used to measure his ambitious plans years ago. The wind lifted again, pushing the edges of her scarf slightly across her shoulder. Meeting them is not the same as being part of their lives, she said calmly. Children do not understand complicated timelines. To them, someone is either there or they are not. Alexander nodded slowly. He understood the meaning immediately. In business, a single meeting could change the course of a deal. In life, it did not work that way. Relationships were built with time that could not be bought or negotiated. He slipped one hand into the pocket of his coat, something he rarely did in public because it made him look less formal. But at that moment, formality seemed irrelevant. I missed 6 years, he said quietly. Zara did not correct him. Instead, she answered with the simple truth that had defined her life since the day she learned she was pregnant. Yes. The word carried neither accusation nor forgiveness. It was simply reality. Alexander looked toward the glass building again. Somewhere on the 47th floor, a boardroom table was already filling with executives waiting for him to begin the morning strategy meeting. Normally, being late would have bothered him more than almost anything. Yet the thought of walking into that room now felt disconnected from the moment standing in front of him. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket and glanced at the screen for the first time since stepping out of the car earlier that morning. For missed notifications were already waiting. His assistant had likely noticed he had not entered the building yet. He hesitated for only a second before typing a short message. The meeting would continue without him today. When he slipped the phone back into his pocket, Zara raised one eyebrow slightly, noticing the small but significant choice. You canceled something important, she said. Alexander allowed a faint breath that almost resembled a smile. I postponed something important, he replied. There is a difference. Zara nodded quietly. She had always understood the weight behind the language of priorities. For a moment, they stood in silence again, while the city continued moving around them. Finally, Zara shifted her bag slightly on her shoulder. I need to get to work, she said. My shift starts in 20 minutes. Alexander looked at her with a hint of curiosity. Where do you work now? She hesitated only briefly before answering. Chicago Community Health Center. I coordinate patient intake and family scheduling. The job sounded practical and steady, exactly the kind of work that required patience and organization. Alexander imagined the daily rhythm of that place. Parents bringing children for checkups, elderly patients asking questions about medications, staff members juggling appointments in narrow hallways. It was a world far removed from the polished offices where his own work unfolded. Yet something about the simplicity of it felt grounded. "They are lucky to have you there," he said. Zara gave a small shrug that dismissed the compliment without rejecting it. "It pays the bills," she replied. "And it keeps the schedule stable for the kids." Alexander noticed the way she said the last words. Everything in her life seemed arranged around those two children. School schedules, work shifts, bus stops. It was a kind of dedication he had never truly witnessed up close before. Zara glanced toward the corner again, where the bus would return later that afternoon. "They get off right over there," she said, pointing gently toward the curb. "Lucas usually runs down the steps first, because he cannot wait to talk about whatever he learned that day. Lila takes her time because she likes watching the bus driver wave goodbye." The description painted a small but vivid picture in Alexander's mind. Two different personalities moving through the same moment in their own ways. "They sound like you," he said quietly. Zara smiled faintly at that. "Lucas inherited curiosity from somewhere," she replied. "And Lila inherited patience from someone else." Alexander understood the quiet implication. Even without meeting them, yet he could already feel the threads connecting their lives. Zara adjusted her coat again and stepped back slightly. 3:15, she repeated once more, making sure the time remained clear. Alexander nodded firmly. "I will be here." She studied him one last time, searching for any sign that he might reconsider once the weight of the morning faded. But the determination in his posture remained steady. After a moment, she gave a small nod of acceptance. "All right." Zara turned and began walking down the sidewalk toward the elevated train station a few blocks away. Alexander watched her go until the crowd of commuters gradually blended her figure into the flow of winter coats and briefcases. When she disappeared around the corner, he remained standing there for another minute, absorbing everything that had happened in less than half an hour. The Chicago skyline rose above him like a row of silent witnesses, glass towers reflecting a sky that looked colder than it had earlier that morning. For years Alexander Reed believed he controlled every direction his life could take. Yet standing on that sidewalk, he realized the most important path ahead of him would not be built with contracts or negotiations. It would begin at a bus stop at 3:15 in the afternoon, when two children stepped down onto the curb and met the father they never expected to see waiting there. When Zara Mitchell disappeared into the morning crowd, the silence she left behind did not feel empty. It felt heavy with possibility. Alexander Reed remained standing at the corner for several more minutes, watching the same street he had walked past hundreds of times, without ever noticing the small bus stop beside it. Now that narrow strip of sidewalk seemed like the most important place in the entire city. A gust of cold wind moved through the glass towers and rattled the metal frame of the bus shelter. Commuters passed him without recognition, their footsteps quick and purposeful as they headed toward office buildings, coffee shops, and train entrances. Normally Alexander would have joined them, stepping into the rhythm of another calculated workday. But the idea of returning upstairs to a polished conference room suddenly felt like stepping into a different life. Instead, he slowly turned and walked along the sidewalk toward the river. The Chicago River moved steadily between its stone banks, gray and calm under the winter sky. Alexander leaned against the railing for a moment and watched the water flow beneath the bridges. For years he had believed his life followed a precise direction, every decision connected to the next through strategy and discipline. Yet this morning had introduced something completely outside that pattern. Two small faces that looked unmistakably familiar. Two names that now echoed quietly in his thoughts. Lucas and Lila. He said the names once under his breath, almost as if testing whether they truly belonged in his life. The sound of them felt both strange and strangely right at the same time. A vibration in his coat pocket pulled him back into the present. He reached for his phone and saw his assistant's name flashing on the screen. Normally he answered within seconds, but this time he hesitated before pressing the button. "Daniel," his assistant's voice said quickly. "The board meeting was supposed to begin 15 minutes ago. The directors are asking if you are joining remotely." Alexander glanced back toward the tall building where his company operated, its glass surface reflecting the dull winter sunlight. For years he had been the first person in every meeting and the last person to leave. But today something inside him refused to return to the familiar pattern. "Reschedule it for tomorrow morning," he said calmly. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Tomorrow morning," Daniel repeated carefully, as if confirming he heard correctly. Yes. Alexander kept his tone steady. Send everyone the revised schedule and tell them I will provide the updated projections personally. Another pause followed, longer this time. Is everything all right? Daniel finally asked. Alexander looked across the river again, watching a pair of seagulls glide low above the water. Everything is changing, he said quietly. Then he ended the call. The truth of those words settled into his mind as he slipped the phone back into his coat pocket. For years his company had been the center of every decision he made. Every flight he booked, every apartment he lived in, every relationship he allowed to fade into the background had been arranged around that single priority. Now 2 children he had never met were suddenly rearranging that entire structure. He straightened and looked at the time on his watch. It was only 9:20 in the morning. More than 6 hours remained before 3:15 arrived. In his normal life, 6 hours could disappear quickly inside a blur of presentations and negotiations. But today the hours stretched ahead of him like a long, quiet road. Alexander turned and walked back toward the intersection where he had first seen the twins that morning. The bus shelter stood empty now except for a single advertisement panel promoting a streaming service. He stepped inside and studied the narrow bench where the children must have been sitting earlier. The details were small but vivid. A faint scuff mark on the pavement where backpacks had scraped the ground. A tiny piece of blue crayon lying near the edge of the curb. Evidence of an ordinary morning that had changed everything for him. He imagined Lucas standing here, shifting his weight impatiently while waiting for the bus. He imagined Lila holding her lunchbox carefully, watching the street with patient curiosity. The images arrived easily now, filling his thoughts with scenes he had never witnessed but somehow felt connected to. For a moment, he wondered what the twins were doing at that exact minute. Perhaps Lucas was raising his hand to answer a math question. Perhaps Lila was reading quietly at her desk, turning the pages slowly the way thoughtful children often do. The idea that they were living their normal school day without knowing he existed nearby created a strange mixture of anticipation and humility. Alexander stepped out of the shelter and walked slowly down the block toward a small cafe he had passed many times but never entered. The bell above the door chimed softly when he stepped inside. The warm smell of fresh coffee and baked bread filled the air. A young barista behind the counter greeted him with an easy smile that showed no recognition of the billionaire who appeared on financial news channels. To her, he was simply another customer escaping the cold. "What can I get you this morning?" she asked. Alexander glanced at the menu board, though he barely registered the list of drinks. His thoughts were still drifting toward the afternoon waiting ahead. "Black coffee," he said. The barista poured the drink and slid the cup across the counter. "Have a good day," she added cheerfully. Alexander nodded in quiet thanks and took a seat by the window where he could see the bus stop across the street. From this angle, the shelter looked small and ordinary, just another piece of city furniture most people ignored. Yet to him it now represented the starting point of a completely different future. He lifted the cup and took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through his hands. Outside, pedestrians continued to move along the sidewalk, their breath visible in the cold air. Time advanced 1 minute at a time. For the first time in years, Alexander Reed was not planning the next step of a business strategy. He was simply waiting for a yellow school bus to return to the corner, waiting for 2 children to step down onto the curb, waiting for the moment when Lucas and Lila would see him standing there and the quiet truth of their lives would finally become something shared instead of hidden. The hours moved differently that day. Inside the cafe, the soft murmur of conversations blended with the quiet hum of the espresso machine, creating a calm rhythm that contrasted sharply with the restless energy in Alexander Reed's mind. Normally, he measured time through productivity, through the steady progress of tasks completed and decisions made. But now each minute felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if the day itself understood that something important was approaching. He sat near the window with his coffee slowly cooling in his hands, watching the bus stop across the street the way a traveler watches the horizon before a long-awaited arrival. Outside, the winter morning gradually softened into midday. The gray sky lifted slightly and thin strips of pale sunlight reflected off the windows of nearby buildings. Office workers hurried past in coats and scarves, some laughing into their phones, others walking with the focused expressions of people already deep into their workday. None of them noticed the man inside the cafe who had quietly stepped out of his usual life to wait for two children he had never met. Every so often Alexander glanced down at his watch. 9:42, 10:17, 11:05. The numbers advanced slowly but steadily. In between those moments, he found himself thinking about details he had never considered before. What subjects Lucas and Lila might enjoy at school. Whether they liked drawing, or reading, or building things with their hands. Whether Lucas preferred science experiments the way Alexander once did as a boy growing up in Ohio. Whether Lila had Zara's patience when solving puzzles or learning something new. The thoughts arrived without effort now, filling the empty spaces that business strategies once occupied. Around noon the cafe began to empty as people returned to their offices. The barista wiped the counter and replaced the pastries in the display case, while soft music played through a speaker near the ceiling. Alexander ordered another coffee simply to remain seated by the window, without appearing unusual. The barista brought the cup with a friendly nod and did not ask questions. Outside, the bus shelter stood quietly beneath the pale winter light. Alexander imagined the twins finishing lunch in their school cafeteria somewhere across the city. Perhaps Lucas talking excitedly about a project he wanted to try at home. Perhaps Lila listening carefully while organizing her backpack for the afternoon classes. The idea that their day continued normally, while his entire world had shifted, felt almost surreal. By 1:30 the sidewalks grew quieter again as the lunch crowd disappeared back into offices. The city seemed to settle into a calmer rhythm, the kind that often arrives in the early afternoon when the morning rush has passed, but evening has not yet begun. Alexander stepped outside the cafe for a moment, letting the cold air clear his thoughts. He walked slowly along the block toward the bus stop once more. Standing there again felt different now. Earlier that morning it had been a place of shock and realization. Now it was a place of anticipation. He studied the route signs posted on the metal pole, reading the schedule carefully even though he already knew the time he was waiting for. A few pedestrians passed behind him, their footsteps echoing softly on the pavement. None of them noticed the quiet determination in his posture. Eventually he returned to the cafe window, choosing the same seat so he could see the corner clearly. The afternoon sun shifted slightly across the street, casting long reflections along the glass panels of the bus shelter. Two teenagers stopped there briefly to check their phones before continuing down the block. The bench remained empty afterward. Alexander checked his watch again. 2:23. Less than an hour now. For the first time that day, he felt something close to nervous anticipation. Boardroom negotiations had never made him nervous. Speaking in front of investors or government officials had never unsettled him either. But meeting his own children for the first time carried a different weight. What would they see when they looked at him? A stranger? A curiosity? Or perhaps simply the man their mother once described to them in quiet explanations before bedtime? He thought again about what Zara had said that morning. That she told them the truth in the simplest way children understand. That their father built a company and did not know they existed. Alexander wondered what image that explanation had created in their young minds. Perhaps they imagined a distant figure who lived somewhere far away, like a character from one of the stories they read in school. The thought made him both grateful and uneasy. Grateful that Zara had protected their understanding with kindness. Uneasy because now he had to step into that imagined space and become real. By 2:45 the cafe had grown quiet again. Only two other customers remained, both working silently on laptops near the back wall. Alexander stood and stepped outside once more, unable to remain seated any longer. The cold air brushed against his face as he walked to the corner and stood beside the bus shelter. From this angle, he could see the long stretch of street where the bus would eventually appear. Cars moved steadily along the avenue, their engines humming softly in the afternoon light. Every few minutes, he checked the time again. 2:52, 2:59, 3:05. The minutes felt slower now, stretching like the quiet seconds before a curtain rises at a theater. Alexander rested one hand lightly against the metal frame of the shelter and looked down the road again. In the distance, he could hear the faint rumble of traffic approaching from several blocks away. Then finally he saw it. A familiar shape turning the corner at the far end of the street. A yellow school bus moving steadily through the intersection, its windows reflecting the pale sky. Alexander felt his breath slow as the vehicle approached. The bus moved closer with each passing second, its large wheels rolling smoothly along the asphalt. He could see small silhouettes through the windows now, children shifting in their seats as the bus prepared to stop. The engine growled gently as the driver eased toward the curb. Alexander stood perfectly still, his attention fixed on the doors at the front of the bus. 6 years of absence had led to this single moment. The bus stopped beside the shelter with a quiet release of air from its brakes. The folding doors opened, and inside, 2 small figures began walking toward the steps. The bus doors opened with a soft mechanical sigh, and the quiet clatter of small footsteps followed immediately after. Children began stepping down one by one, their backpacks bouncing lightly against their shoulders as they reached the sidewalk and scattered toward waiting parents or the familiar paths home. Alexander Reed stood just a few feet away from the curb, his attention focused entirely on the narrow stairwell inside the bus, where 2 small silhouettes were slowly moving closer to the door. The first one appeared exactly the way Zara had described earlier that morning. Lucas stepped down quickly, almost hopping the final step as if the bus ride had lasted far longer than he liked. His navy backpack slid halfway down his shoulder while he looked around with bright curiosity, scanning the sidewalk with the alert excitement of a child who had spent the entire day waiting to tell someone about it. A second later, Lila appeared behind him. She moved more slowly, one small hand gripping the railing as she carefully descended the steps. Her lunchbox hung neatly from her wrist, and her eyes paused for a moment to look back toward the driver's seat before she lifted her hand in a polite little wave. The driver waved back with a warm smile before closing the door again. The bus pulled away, leaving the gentle rumble of its engine fading down the street. As the afternoon air settled back into quiet, Lucas adjusted his backpack and turned toward the sidewalk with quick energy. "Mom is probably already here," he said with the confident tone of someone who believed routines rarely changed. Lila stepped beside him, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as she scanned the corner with patient curiosity. "She always waits by the sign," she replied calmly. The 2 children walked a few steps forward together, their small shoes tapping softly against the pavement. Then Lucas stopped. His attention had shifted toward the tall figure standing beside the bus shelter. Alexander Reed felt the moment arrive before a single word was spoken. Lucas tilted his head slightly, studying him with the same thoughtful expression Alexander had noticed earlier that morning. For several seconds the boy simply looked at him, as if comparing something in his mind with the person standing in front of him. Lila followed his gaze and turned her eyes toward Alexander as well. Her expression was quieter, but just as observant. Children sometimes notice things adults overlook, and in that moment both of them seemed to sense that the man standing near the shelter was not just another passerby. Alexander felt his heartbeat slow and steady in his chest. He had delivered keynote speeches to hundreds of investors without hesitation, yet standing there in front of 2 small children felt far more important than any presentation he had ever given. Lucas took a small step closer. His curiosity appeared stronger than any shyness. "Do you know our mom?" he asked with direct honesty. Alexander felt the question settle gently in the air between them. He crouched slightly so that he was closer to their eye level, careful not to overwhelm the moment with sudden movement. "Yes," he said softly. "I spoke with her this morning." Lila studied his face quietly, her gray eyes thoughtful in a way that looked uncannily familiar. Lucas crossed his arms for a moment, thinking carefully the way children often do when solving a puzzle. Then he said something that made Alexander's breath pause for just a fraction of a second. "You look like us." The statement was simple, spoken with innocent observation rather than accusation. Alexander allowed a small, gentle smile to appear. "I noticed that too," he replied calmly. Lucas glanced at Lila, as if confirming the discovery. She nodded once, still studying Alexander's features with careful attention. "Your eyes are the same," she said quietly. The moment hung softly between them, delicate but full of meaning. Before Alexander could respond, another voice approached from behind the children. "Lucas, Lila." Zara Mitchell walked quickly toward them from the direction of the train station, her steps calm but purposeful. When the twins turned to see her, they ran the final few feet and wrapped their arms around her waist in an easy afternoon hug. "How was school today?" she asked warmly. Lucas spoke first, his words rushing out with excitement. "We started building a volcano for science class, and I got to mix the baking soda, and the teacher said mine worked the best." Lila followed more patiently. And I finished my reading book today, she added with quiet pride. Zara smiled and brushed her hand gently across their hair before glancing up toward Alexander. The brief look between them carried a quiet understanding. She had kept her promise. Now the moment belonged to him. Lucas turned back toward Alexander again. Mom, he said thoughtfully. This man said he talked to you this morning. Zara nodded gently. That is true. Lila looked between the two adults, sensing something important in the way they were standing. Is he a friend? She asked softly. Zara crouched slightly so she could meet both children at eye level. Her voice remained calm, steady, and clear. Lucas, Lila, she said gently. This is the person I told you about. The twins looked at her with sudden focus. The one who built the company? Lucas asked. Zara nodded once. Yes. Lila's thoughtful gaze returned slowly to Alexander's face. For a few seconds neither child spoke. Then Lucas said something very quietly, almost as if he was testing the idea aloud. Is he our dad? The question rested in the afternoon air like a small, but powerful truth finally spoken out loud. Zara placed one gentle hand on each child's shoulder. Yes, she said softly. The twins looked back at Alexander again. This time the silence felt different. Lucas stepped forward first, his curiosity still stronger than any uncertainty. So that means you know a lot about computers, he said with simple excitement. Alexander let out a quiet breath that almost turned into a laugh of relief. Yes, he replied gently. I suppose I do. Lila stepped closer as well, her calm eyes still studying his face with quiet attention. After a moment, she asked the question that had been quietly forming in her mind. Are you staying this time? Alexander looked at the two children standing in front of him, their small faces carrying pieces of himself he had never known existed. And for the first time in 6 years the answer came without hesitation. Yes, he said quietly. I am. The quiet answer settled over the sidewalk like a promise that had taken 6 years to finally reach its moment. Lucas looked up at Alexander with open curiosity, the kind that only children possess when the world suddenly becomes larger and more interesting. Lila remained a step closer to Zara, her thoughtful eyes still studying the man in front of her as if she was carefully measuring whether his words felt true. The winter afternoon air moved softly through the street, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and the occasional echo of footsteps from people passing along the block. For a moment none of them spoke. Then Lucas did what children often do when faced with something extraordinary. He moved forward with practical excitement instead of hesitation. If you know computers, Lucas said quickly, then maybe you can help me build a robot. Alexander blinked once, surprised by how naturally the request arrived. He felt a small smile form before he could stop it. A robot, he repeated gently. Lucas nodded with enthusiasm. Our teacher says robots can help people do jobs faster. I want to build one that can carry groceries for Mom, so she does not have to walk so far from the store. Zara's eyes softened at the explanation, though she tried not to interrupt the conversation. Alexander looked at Lucas with growing warmth. The idea was simple and sincere, the kind of practical kindness that children sometimes understand more clearly than adults. That sounds like a very good invention, he said calmly. And I would be happy to help you learn how to build it. Lucas grinned immediately, the kind of grin that made the resemblance between father and son impossible to ignore. Lila stepped forward a little as well now, her curiosity finally overcoming her quiet caution. Do you build robots too? She asked. Alexander shook his head gently. Not exactly. My company builds systems that help computers talk to each other, so people around the world can share information quickly. Lila considered the explanation carefully. Like when our teacher sends homework to our parents' phones? She asked thoughtfully. Alexander nodded. Yes, something like that. Lucas tilted his head again, studying Alexander's face the same way he had earlier. Mom said you did not know we were here, he said simply. Zara watched the moment carefully, her hands resting lightly on both children's shoulders. Alexander did not look away from Lucas when he answered. That is true, he said quietly. If I had known, I would have come sooner. Lucas accepted the answer with surprising ease, the way children sometimes accept truths adults struggle with for years. He nodded once and shifted his backpack higher on his shoulder. Okay, he said. Lila remained thoughtful for another second before asking her own question. Are you coming tomorrow too? She asked gently. The simplicity of the question struck Alexander more deeply than he expected. For 6 years these children had lived their lives without him. Now they were already imagining what tomorrow might look like. He answered slowly but clearly. "If you would like me to," he said. Lucas responded immediately. "Yes," he said with complete certainty. Zara allowed herself a small quiet breath, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly now that the first moments had passed without confusion or fear. She looked at the twins with gentle patience. "We should start heading home," she said softly. "We still have homework and dinner to make." Lucas nodded, though his attention quickly returned to Alexander again. "Do you want to walk with us?" he asked hopefully. The question hung in the air like an invitation that carried far more meaning than a simple walk down the street. Alexander glanced briefly at Zara. She met his eyes calmly and gave a small nod of permission. "I would like that," Alexander said. The four of them began walking together along the sidewalk. Lucas moved slightly ahead, already describing the volcano project from science class with animated gestures. "First we mix baking soda and vinegar," he explained proudly. "Then the foam comes out like lava, but it is safe because it is just bubbles." Alexander listened carefully, asking questions that encouraged Lucas to continue explaining every detail of the experiment. Lila walked beside Zara, though every few steps she glanced toward Alexander again with quiet curiosity. Eventually, she spoke in a softer voice. "Did you like science when you were little?" she asked. Alexander nodded. "Very much. I used to take apart old radios just to see how they worked." Lila's eyes brightened slightly at the idea. "Did you put them back together?" she asked. Alexander smiled faintly. "Sometimes." The small group continued down the block until the tall office buildings gradually gave way to quieter residential streets. Trees lined the sidewalks, their branches bare against the pale winter sky. Lucas walked along the curb edge, balancing carefully as he continued describing every moment of his school day. Lila eventually moved closer to Alexander's side, her small steps matching his longer stride, as if she was slowly becoming comfortable with his presence. "Our apartment is 3 blocks that way," Lucas said suddenly, pointing down a side street. Zara nodded. "We live on the 2nd floor," she added calmly. Alexander looked toward the direction Lucas had pointed, imagining the space where these children had grown up. The thought filled him with a mixture of gratitude and quiet regret. Zara noticed the expression on his face, but said nothing. When they reached the corner, Lucas stopped and turned around again. "Are you coming tomorrow?" he asked once more, as if confirming the promise he had heard earlier. Alexander crouched slightly, so they were eye level again. "Yes," he said gently. Lucas seemed satisfied with the answer. Lila looked at him for another moment before stepping forward and giving him a quick small hug around the shoulders. The gesture was brief but sincere. Then she returned to Zara's side as if nothing unusual had happened. Alexander remained still for a second after the hug ended, absorbing the quiet trust in that simple moment. Zara watched him with calm understanding. "They will see you again tomorrow," she said softly. Alexander nodded. For the first time in many years, he felt certain about where he needed to be the next day. The small hug lingered in Alexander Reed's mind long after Lila stepped back beside her mother. It had lasted no more than 2 seconds, yet the quiet trust in that simple gesture felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. Lucas was already moving again, walking along the edge of the sidewalk with careful balance while continuing his enthusiastic explanation about the science experiment. "Tomorrow we are going to paint the volcano," he said proudly. "Mine is going to be the tallest one in the class." Zara smiled gently as she listened, her hand resting lightly on Lila's shoulder while they continued down the quiet residential street. The city noise faded gradually behind them as the tall office buildings gave way to older brick apartments and narrow tree-lined sidewalks. Alexander walked beside them, absorbing every detail with a kind of quiet attention he had never given to an afternoon before. Lucas hopped down from the curb and turned back again. "If you come tomorrow," he said thoughtfully, "you can see the volcano when it erupts." Alexander nodded. "I would like that very much." The boy seemed satisfied with the answer and resumed walking forward again. Lila glanced up at Alexander as they approached the next corner. "Do you live far away?" she asked softly. Alexander paused for a second before answering honestly. "Not very far," he said. "My apartment is on the other side of the river." Lila considered that information carefully. "So you can come to the bus stop again," she said. "Yes," Alexander replied gently. I can. They reached the building Lucas had pointed to earlier, a modest brick apartment with a small staircase leading to the second floor. Zara stopped at the base of the stairs and looked toward Alexander. This is where we live, she said calmly. Lucas climbed the first 2 steps quickly before turning around again. Tomorrow, he reminded with cheerful certainty. Alexander nodded once more. Tomorrow. Lila gave him another small thoughtful look before following her brother up the steps. Zara remained at the bottom of the staircase for a moment after the children went inside. The afternoon light had begun to soften into early evening, and the quiet street carried the faint smell of someone cooking dinner in a nearby apartment. Zara crossed her arms lightly against the cool air and looked at Alexander. They liked you, she said. Alexander let out a quiet breath he had not realized he was holding. They are remarkable, he replied softly. Zara nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. They have had a simple life, she said. School, homework, neighborhood parks. Nothing complicated. Alexander understood what she meant. She was not simply describing their routine. She was explaining the fragile balance she had built for them over the past 6 years. I do not want to disrupt that, he said carefully. Zara studied his face, measuring the sincerity behind his words the same way she always had. Being part of their lives will change things, she said calmly. Children notice everything. Alexander nodded slowly. Then I will make sure the changes are good ones. The quiet certainty in his voice made Zara pause for a moment. For years, she had watched interviews where business reporters described Alexander Reed as a man who built companies with relentless determination. Standing here now, she recognized that same determination appearing in a very different direction. She looked toward the apartment window where Lucas had already pulled the curtain aside to peek down at the street. When he saw Alexander still standing there, he waved energetically through the glass. Alexander lifted his hand and waved back. Lucas disappeared again a second later, likely rushing to tell Lila something exciting about the moment. Zara noticed the exchange and allowed a small smile. They will talk about this all evening, she said quietly. Alexander nodded. I imagine they will have questions. Zara tilted her head slightly. They always do. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet street felt almost peaceful compared to the rush of downtown Chicago only a few blocks away. Finally, Zara broke the silence. You said you would come tomorrow, she reminded him. I will, Alexander replied without hesitation. Zara held his gaze for another second, as if confirming that the promise carried real weight. Then she nodded once. All right. She turned toward the stairs, but paused halfway up before speaking again. Alexander. He looked up. Yes. Zara met his eyes one more time. They do not need a perfect father, she said calmly. They just need someone who shows up. The words settled deeply into Alexander's mind. For years he had built a life based on extraordinary achievements, believing success required constant expansion and precision. Now the most important expectation in front of him was far simpler. Show up. He nodded slowly. I understand. Zara gave a small acknowledging look and continued up the stairs. The apartment door closed quietly behind her a moment later. Alexander remained on the sidewalk for another minute, looking up at the window where the curtain moved again as Lucas and Lila peeked out once more. The twins waved again with bright excitement before disappearing into the warm light of their home. Alexander finally turned and began walking back toward the main avenue. The evening sky had shifted into deeper shades of gray and gold as the sun lowered behind the buildings. Traffic sounds grew louder again as he approached the busier streets near the river. Yet his thoughts were not on the city around him. They were already moving forward to the next morning. For the first time in 6 years, Alexander Reed had a place he needed to be that had nothing to do with business meetings or corporate decisions. Tomorrow morning, there would be a bus stop. 2 children with bright curiosity and quiet patience, and a father who intended to be there when they arrived. That evening, the city lights reflected across the Chicago River like long ribbons of gold and silver stretching between the buildings. And for the first time in many years, Alexander Reed walked through the downtown streets without thinking about the next business decision waiting for him. Usually when the sun set over the skyline, his schedule was still full of calls with international offices, financial reviews, and strategy sessions that stretched late into the night. But tonight he walked more slowly, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, while the cool evening air moved softly along the sidewalks. The images from the afternoon replayed in his mind again and again. Lucas stepping off the bus with restless energy. Lila studying his face with quiet curiosity before asking the one question that mattered most. Are you staying this time? The words had been simple, but they carried a weight that had followed him across every block since he left the apartment building. By the time he reached his own building across the river, the sky had darkened completely. The tall glass tower where he lived overlooked the water, its lobby lit with soft white lights and quiet music that echoed gently against the marble floor. The concierge looked up from the desk with polite recognition. "Good evening, Mr. Reed." Alexander nodded in greeting and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed with a quiet hum, and the numbers above the panel began to climb toward the top floors. Normally during this ride, he reviewed emails or messages on his phone, already preparing for the next conversation waiting ahead. Tonight he did not reach for the phone. Instead, he leaned lightly against the elevator wall and thought about the small apartment across the city where two children were likely finishing their homework at the kitchen table. He imagined Lucas explaining the volcano project again with animated gestures while Lila carefully turned the pages of her reading book. The image felt surprisingly vivid, even though he had never seen their home from the inside. When the elevator opened onto the private floor of his apartment, the quiet space felt larger than usual. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out across the river, and the distant lights of the city stretched into the dark horizon. The apartment had once felt like a symbol of success, a reward for years of relentless work. Now the polished furniture and quiet rooms carried a different feeling. They felt empty in a way he had never noticed before. Alexander walked slowly toward the large window and looked down at the water below. Somewhere beyond the tall buildings, Lucas and Lila were living the ordinary evening routine of children who had no idea how profoundly their lives had already changed that day. He wondered what Zara had told them after he left. Perhaps she was answering the same questions he had heard earlier at the bus stop. Perhaps Lucas was already talking about building a robot together. The thought made him smile faintly. A soft vibration in his coat pocket interrupted his thoughts. When he pulled out his phone, he saw several new messages from Daniel, his assistant. The board meeting had been rescheduled successfully, and the directors wanted to confirm a time for the following morning. Alexander stared at the screen for a moment before typing a short reply. The meeting would begin later than usual. For the first time in the history of Reed Global Systems, the chief executive officer would arrive at the office after 9 o'clock. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned toward the kitchen where the soft light of the city reflected across the marble counter. Normally dinner in the apartment meant a delivery order and a quick meal eaten while reviewing documents. Tonight, he opened the refrigerator and realized he was not particularly hungry. His thoughts remained somewhere else entirely. After a few minutes, he returned to the window again, looking out at the skyline while the quiet hum of the city filled the room. Across town, in a smaller apartment above a quiet street, Zara Mitchell was standing at the kitchen sink while Lucas and Lila finished their homework at the table. Lucas had spent most of dinner talking excitedly about the afternoon. He said he would help me build the robot, he reminded for the third time. Lila looked up from her book with thoughtful eyes. He also said he would come tomorrow, she added calmly. Zara dried her hands with a towel and leaned lightly against the counter. Yes, she said softly. Lucas looked curious again. Did you know he would come today? Zara shook her head gently. No, I only found out this morning. Lila studied her mother's expression for a moment before asking another careful question. Are you happy he came? Zara paused before answering. I am happy that you met him, she said honestly. Lucas seemed satisfied with that response. He returned to drawing a small robot in the margin of his notebook, already imagining the project he wanted to build. Lila closed her book and glanced toward the window where the evening lights of the neighborhood glowed softly. I think he looks nervous, she said quietly. Zara smiled faintly at that observation. Sometimes grown-ups are nervous when something important happens, she explained. Lila nodded as if the answer made perfect sense. Across the city, Alexander continued standing by the window in his quiet apartment, unaware that the children were already discussing him in their own small living room. For 6 years his life had been defined by one clear direction. Build the company. Expand the technology. Stay ahead of every competitor. But now another direction had appeared unexpectedly, one that could not be measured in profits or growth charts. Tomorrow morning there would be a bus stop again. Lucas, with his bright curiosity, Lila with her quiet questions, and a father who had finally decided that the most important place in the world to be was standing on that corner when the yellow bus arrived. Morning arrived quietly over Chicago, the pale winter sunlight spreading slowly across the skyline as the city woke to another weekday. Inside the tall glass tower overlooking the river, Alexander Reed stood in front of the wide window of his apartment with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the early traffic move across the bridges below. Normally mornings began with numbers and emails, and financial forecasts already waiting on his phone before he even left the bedroom. But today he had not opened a single report. Instead, his attention remained fixed on something much simpler. The bus stop, the quiet corner where two children would soon begin their school day. He checked the time on the clock beside the kitchen counter. 7:23. There was still enough time to reach the corner before the yellow bus arrived. The thought created a small sense of anticipation he had not felt in years. Alexander placed the cup on the counter and reached for his coat, moving through the apartment with a quiet purpose that felt completely different from his usual routine. When the elevator doors opened in the lobby a few minutes later, the concierge looked up with a polite nod of recognition. "Good morning, Mr. Reed." Alexander returned the greeting and stepped outside into the cold air. The streets carried the familiar rhythm of commuters beginning their day. Taxi engines idled along the curb, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted from a cafe on the corner. Normally, he would walk toward his office tower at this hour. Today, he turned in the opposite direction. The walk across the river felt shorter than it had the previous evening, perhaps because his attention was no longer divided between meetings and schedules. Instead, every step carried him toward the small corner that had suddenly become the most important place in the city. When he reached the street, the bus shelter looked almost exactly as it had the day before. The metal bench, the narrow sign marking the route, the faint scuff on the pavement where children's backpacks had scraped against the ground. Alexander stood near the shelter and glanced down the street. A few early commuters passed him without notice. The cold wind brushed lightly along the sidewalk while the sky slowly brightened overhead. Then he saw them. Lucas and Lila were walking toward the corner with Zara, their backpacks bouncing gently against their shoulders as they talked about something that seemed to make Lucas laugh. Lila listened quietly beside him, occasionally adding a thoughtful comment before Lucas resumed speaking with energetic enthusiasm. When Lucas spotted Alexander standing by the shelter, he stopped immediately. His face lit up with the same excitement he had shown the afternoon before. "You came," he said with complete certainty. Alexander smiled softly. "I said I would." Lila looked pleased as well, though her reaction remained calmer. "Good morning," she said politely. "Good morning," Alexander replied. Zara approached the corner with the children and gave him a small acknowledging nod. The quiet understanding between them did not need words. Lucas stepped closer, adjusting his backpack. "I brought the drawing of the robot," he announced proudly while pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He opened it carefully and showed Alexander the sketch. The drawing included wheels, long mechanical arms, and a square head with two small antennae. Alexander studied the paper with genuine interest. "This looks very promising," he said. Lucas grinned widely. "I think it can carry grocery bags and maybe even help wash dishes." Lila leaned closer to look at the drawing again. "It might need stronger arms," she suggested thoughtfully. Lucas nodded as if the idea had just improved the entire design. The conversation continued naturally while they waited beside the curb. For Alexander, the moment felt strangely peaceful. For the first time in many years, his morning was not shaped by pressure or deadlines. It was shaped by the curiosity of two children discussing a robot that did not exist yet. In the distance, the rumble of a bus engine approached the intersection. Lucas heard it first and turned toward the street. "That is ours," he said quickly. The yellow bus appeared around the corner and rolled slowly toward the stop. The doors opened and several children began climbing aboard. Lucas stepped onto the first stair and turned back toward Alexander. "Do not forget," he reminded. "After school we can start building the robot." Alexander nodded. "I will be here." Lucas seemed satisfied and continued up the steps. Lila followed more carefully, pausing halfway to look back down at Alexander. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. Then she stepped inside the bus. The doors closed, and the vehicle pulled away with a soft roar of its engine. Alexander remained standing beside the shelter while the bus disappeared down the street. Zara stayed beside him for a moment longer. They were watching the window all morning, she said gently. Alexander looked down the road where the bus had vanished. I imagine they were. Zara studied his expression for a moment before speaking again. You changed your schedule. Alexander nodded. Yes. Zara tilted her head. Slightly. That cannot be easy for someone who runs a company the size of yours. Alexander allowed a small breath of reflection. Some schedules should change, he said quietly. Zara looked toward the street once more, and then back at him. Lucas will talk about that robot every hour until it is built, she said. Alexander smiled faintly at the thought. Then we should start planning. Zara gave a small nod and stepped away from the curb. I have to get to work, she said. Alexander watched her walk down the block toward the train station again, the same path she had taken the previous day. When she disappeared around the corner, he remained standing at the bus stop for another moment. The quiet morning air carried the distant sounds of the city beginning its day. But Alexander Reed no longer felt like a man rushing toward the next business decision. He felt like someone who had finally discovered the place he was meant to stand every morning. The quiet morning settled slowly into the rhythm of the day after the yellow bus disappeared around the corner. For several seconds Alexander Reed remained standing beside the shelter exactly where Lucas and Lila had left him, watching the empty stretch of road where the bus had been only moments earlier. The metal bench behind him was still cool from the early air, and the faint sound of traffic drifted from the larger avenue a block away. For years his mornings had been measured by the rapid movement of business decisions, by meetings that began before sunrise and emails that arrived long before the city fully woke. Now his morning had been defined by a simple promise at a bus stop and the bright excitement of a boy holding a drawing of a robot. The shift felt both unfamiliar and strangely right. After a moment, he began walking toward the river again, his steps steady but unhurried. The office tower that held the headquarters of his company rose clearly into view as he approached downtown, its glass surface reflecting the pale winter light. Usually by this time of day, he would already be inside the building surrounded by analysts, engineers, and executives discussing the next expansion of Reed Global Systems. Today he walked past the entrance without stopping. Instead, he continued along the sidewalk toward the cafe he had visited the previous afternoon. The bell above the door chimed softly when he stepped inside. The same barista looked up with a friendly smile of recognition. Good morning again, she said. Alexander nodded politely and ordered another cup of black coffee before taking the same seat by the window where he could see the bus stop across the street. Outside, commuters passed by in the steady current of the weekday morning. Yet Alexander's attention remained on the empty shelter where Lucas and Lila had stood only minutes earlier. As he lifted the cup and took a quiet sip, he found himself thinking about the drawing Lucas had shown him. The small robot with wheels and long mechanical arms. The idea had been simple, but full of purpose. Carry groceries for Mom. The thought stayed with him as the minutes moved forward. For years Alexander had built systems designed to move enormous amounts of information across continents in seconds. But perhaps the most meaningful project in front of him now was far smaller and far more personal. A robot built from cardboard and small motors that could make 2 children believe their ideas mattered. The thought made him smile slightly. Across the city, the morning routine continued at Zara's apartment as well. Lucas and Lila had already settled into their classroom desks, their backpacks hanging neatly beside their chairs while the teacher began the first lesson of the day. Lucas had spent the bus ride talking excitedly about the robot drawing he had shown Alexander. Several classmates listened with curiosity while Lila watched quietly from the seat beside him, occasionally adding thoughtful suggestions about how the robot could be improved. By mid-morning, the idea had grown even larger in Lucas's imagination. He had drawn another version of the robot in the margin of his notebook, this time adding extra wheels and a small control panel. When recess arrived, he ran across the playground explaining the design to 2 of his friends, his voice filled with the same bright enthusiasm that had greeted Alexander at the bus stop earlier that morning. Meanwhile, Lila sat on a bench near the edge of the playground reading a chapter from her book, though every so often she glanced toward the sky, as if remembering the promise that had been made before the bus doors closed. Back at the cafe, Alexander finished his coffee and checked the time. 10:38. Normally by that hour, he would have already completed several conference calls with offices in Europe. Today the quiet space around him felt almost peaceful. The The city continued moving at its usual pace while his own day unfolded with a slower sense of purpose. After another moment, he stood and stepped outside again, crossing the street toward the bus shelter. Standing there in the daylight, he could easily imagine the scene that would repeat in a few hours. The yellow bus turning the corner. Lucas stepping down with restless excitement. Lila following with quiet patience. And the three of them beginning the small project that had already started growing in Lucas's mind. The thought brought a calm sense of certainty that had been missing from his life for longer than he realized. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. A few quick messages appeared on the screen from Daniel confirming the revised meeting schedule and several updates from department managers. Alexander typed a short reply acknowledging the reports and then paused for a moment before writing one more message. He asked the engineering division to locate a simple robotic starter kit that could be delivered to his office by the afternoon. The instructions were clear and brief. When he placed the phone back into his pocket, he looked once more at the quiet bus stop. The place that had once been just another piece of street furniture had now become the starting point of something entirely new. For the first time in years, Alexander Reed felt certain that the most important work of his life was no longer happening inside a corporate boardroom. It was waiting beside a small metal bench where two children would step down from a yellow bus and expect him to be there. The afternoon light stretched across the quiet Chicago street as the day slowly leaned toward the moment Alexander Reed had been waiting for since early morning. The bus stop stood exactly where it always had, a simple metal bench beside the narrow curb, but now it felt like the center of a small universe that had quietly reshaped his life. He arrived early again, standing beside the shelter with a small cardboard box resting carefully in his hands. Inside the box was the robotic starter kit he had asked the engineering team to locate earlier that day. Simple electric motors, plastic wheels, wires, and a small controller board. Nothing complicated compared to the advanced systems his company built every day, yet to Lucas it would feel like the beginning of something extraordinary. The street remained calm in the late afternoon light. A few pedestrians passed by carrying grocery bags or talking softly on their phones. From the nearby cafe drifted the faint smell of roasted coffee and warm bread. Alexander checked the time on his watch. 3:11. Only a few minutes remained. The anticipation felt familiar now, but no less meaningful. In the distance, he heard the low rumble of a bus engine turning the corner several blocks away. He stepped slightly closer to the curb, the cardboard box balanced easily in his arms. A moment later, the yellow bus appeared at the far end of the street and rolled steadily toward the stop. Through the wide windows, he could already see the movement of children shifting in their seats as the vehicle slowed. The brakes released with a soft sigh of air, and the doors opened. Lucas appeared first again, just as he had the day before, hopping down the final step with restless energy before his eyes immediately found Alexander waiting beside the shelter. "You came again," he said happily, though the certainty in his voice suggested he had never doubted it. Alexander smiled and lifted the small box slightly. "I brought something that might help with the robot." Lucas's eyes widened instantly. "Is that the parts?" he asked. Lila stepped down behind him, her lunchbox swinging gently from her hand. She studied the box with quiet curiosity. "What is inside?" she asked. Alexander knelt slightly so they could see the contents as he opened the lid. The twins leaned closer together, examining the small motors and wheels with careful attention. Lucas's excitement returned immediately. "We can make the arms move with those," he said, pointing to the motors. Lila nodded thoughtfully. "And the wheels can help it carry things," she added. The bus doors closed behind them and the vehicle pulled away, leaving the four of them standing quietly at the corner again. Zara approached from the same direction she had the previous afternoon, arriving just as Lucas finished explaining how the robot might lift grocery bags from the floor. When she saw the open box, she raised an eyebrow slightly. "You brought equipment already," she said with gentle surprise. Alexander closed the lid carefully. Lucas seemed very serious about the project. Lucas looked pleased by that observation. "We can start today," he suggested eagerly. Zara laughed softly. "After homework," she corrected. Lila nodded in agreement. "Homework first," she repeated calmly. The small group began walking toward the apartment again, Lucas talking quickly about the robot design, while Lila occasionally added thoughtful improvements to the plan. Alexander carried the box easily beside them, listening to every idea with genuine attention. The residential street felt warmer now in the late afternoon sun, and the quiet neighborhood seemed almost peaceful compared to the busy downtown streets only a few blocks away. When they reached the apartment building, Lucas turned immediately toward the stairs. "We can build it on the kitchen table," he said excitedly. Zara shook her head with patient amusement. "You will both finish your homework first," she reminded again. Lucas sighed dramatically but climbed the steps anyway. Lila followed more calmly before pausing near the door to look back down at Alexander. "You came back," she said quietly, almost as if confirming the promise once more. Alexander nodded gently. "I told you I would." The door opened and Lucas disappeared inside with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Lila stepped through more slowly before giving Alexander a small wave. Zara remained at the bottom of the stairs for a moment after the children entered. The warm light from the apartment window reflected softly across the street. She looked at Alexander and then at the box he carried. "You did not have to do that," she said calmly. Alexander glanced toward the window where Lucas's shadow moved excitedly behind the curtain. "Yes," he replied quietly. "I did." Zara studied him for a moment before speaking again. "They will remember this," she said softly. Alexander nodded. "I hope they remember that I showed up." Zara's expression softened slightly at the answer. She stepped up the stairs and paused beside the door before looking back at him once more. "Dinner is usually at 6, she said. The invitation was simple but clear. Alexander understood its meaning immediately. "Then I will come back at 6, he said. Zara gave a small nod and stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. Alexander remained on the sidewalk for a moment longer, looking up at the apartment window where two small silhouettes now moved around the kitchen table. The cardboard box still rested in his hands, but it felt lighter than when he first carried it to the bus stop, because now it represented more than a small robotics project. It represented the beginning of something he had nearly lost without ever knowing it existed. Across the quiet Chicago street, the evening light settled softly over the neighborhood. And for the first time in years, Alexander Reed understood that success was not measured by the towers his company built or the markets it reached. It was measured by the simple promise he intended to keep every day from now on, standing beside a small bus stop where two children expected their father to be there.